Yeah, I didn't hear from her, so. All right. Um, well, we've come to the end. We've come to the end of the book, and we've come to the end of our discussion, and, you know, chapter 8, before Jesus became white. So
Yeah.
thoughts, hopes, dreams, fears, observations.
I think it is interesting that we always read about Jesus eating with people who were not the touchable people, not the good people. And yet, and even I remember Barbara Brown Taylor, and I wish I could remember the exact quote that she said, because I used to keep it on my desk and I can't find it now. Of course, I might need to clean my desk off. But it said something to the effect of, who you eat with is who you are known by. You know, your relationship with people at the table, because you're touching and you're touching the same food and you're reaching into the same dish. And so when you eat with with different people, when you eat with people who are considered the untouchables or the sinners or the outcasts, you're actually identifying with them and caring for them. And that really struck me as I was reading this, thinking, yeah, we've really gotten a long way away from wanting to be with people who are not like us.
Yeah.
Yeah, because one of the keys at our church is fellowship.
Well,
Oh,
I
yeah.
was thinking about,
I didn't even think about that, but yeah.
we've been in a lot of churches where they use the life group model, where you go to someone's home and you share
Mm-hmm.
a meal with them, and that being in that kind of environment, you get to know people better, and it form better relationships that way because it's less formal. But I never thought about the fact that that's just like-minded, or maybe not so much like-minded, but that's people just that are already Christians. Like, that's not the exact model that it should be. We should be welcoming in those people who aren't like us and having those meals. And that's very much a ministry opportunity just for your family, basically. And I just hadn't thought about it that way.
Let's go to the back.
But- Yeah, I think the other thing that, they're pointing out there is that, well, here comes Bonnie now. Um, is that type of table fellowship, it certainly was more intimate than most table fellowship we have today, because not only did the style of the way people sort of lounged around tables, if you will, in that time, but also, they ate a lot of food with their hands, and Westerners don't typically do that. I'm always reminded, if you've ever eaten Moroccan food, you sit around a big table and a big plate and you dip into the same plate and all eat it with your hand, and that's much more in line with the sort of table fellowship that Jesus was engaged in, and it's a lot more intimate. I mean, to dip your sort of hand into food with other people is, way more intimate than just eating off your individual plate with a fork and knife.
I still think about how grossed out I was at a restaurant. I was at a minister's meeting, and another minister double dipped in the salsa.
Double dip.
And I couldn't touch the salsa after that. And now I think about, that's really how it was in Jesus's day, that they dipped into the same pot. I mean, the same bowl, whatever they had. And whatever grosses me out now, that would have been normal.
Well, Joyce, that's why you need to have wine with your meals. You need the antiseptic to, so there's always the counterbalance.
Don't
Like,
worry, Joyce. We wouldn't have been invited at that table because as women, we would
Exactly.
not have been allowed to eat.
You're right, Jen. We would not have been because women weren't allowed. But interestingly enough, we have so many instances of Jesus teaching women and talking to women and
Right.
welcoming women. You got to wonder if the women were allowed at the table too.
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, we don't have any, concrete knowledge of that, but I mean, I think one of the things that struck me as very profound and not necessarily from the book, but in general, I had read an article recently that talked about the number of times that the Bible speaks about Jesus eating with lots of different people, including the Pharisees. So the one time when Jesus ate with the Pharisees, another time when Jesus was eating with the Pharisees, and they were talking about these things, eating was part of almost every communication. So I think the inclusivity of Jesus is the real message that we're supposed to get from that. It's not about just eating with sinners or eating with saints. It's about not excluding anyone.
right.
Yep.
It's also amazing just thinking of that, why didn't they have an obesity problem?
Probably because they walked all over the place.
Very rare that they rode a donkey. Anything else.
Or took a boat.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
worked all the time. And
Yeah.
it was a Mediterranean diet, by the way, that my
there you
doctor keeps trying to put me on.
Well, there's something to be said for that diet, but I think you're right, Jen, that the sort of inclusivity of it, and the way they presented
But the fact that it included the diversity or encouraged, it created diversity so that diversity was good. You didn't want everybody sitting in the same place. You wanted people spread out and doing more.
right, yeah, and what I started to say before I
I'm sorry.
lost my link there for a second, was I thought it was interesting, speaking of inclusivity and diversity, the way they juxtapose the Tower of Babel and the Pentecost thing, because we often juxtapose those, but we do it in the way that they were talking about how we shouldn't, I mean, whether their biblical analysis is accurate or not, that's beside the point. But I thought it was interesting that, they sort of highlighted the fact that really, this was much more about diversity and how God embraces that diversity than some kind of punishment, which is pretty much how we look at the Tower of Babel, really.
I found that interesting. I don't know what y'all were talking about because we got kicked out. But I also found interesting the discussion of Peter.
Oh, yeah.
All that, because he does the same thing in Galatians. He falls back into falling with the Jews and not with the Gentiles, even after the incident in Acts where he goes to, I forgot, a Roman centurion or whatever, and heals and meets with him when he has the dream about, unclean food. So he falls back in more blatantly with the prejudices in that instance, and Paul reprimands him.
Right.
But I also found the geographical discussion interesting too.
Mhm.
Oh, with the east and west of the Sea of Galilee,
Mhm.
or as they put it in the vernacular of today, the wrong side of the tracks.
Right. Yeah. Although I do have to admit that when they kept on talking about the west side, all of a sudden I was going, da-da-da, da-da-da. Just trying to picture how Jesus would have dealt with that. But
Um,
We just all out of it. I mean,
Yeah.
hey, Bonnie, hi there.
I took this book to people in my church. They bill themselves as a multicultural, multi-ethnic group. And most of the, while the founder of the church is white, the leadership underneath him for 2 layers is Black or Hispanic. And I took it to them and I asked them what they thought of this. And they thought that this was heresy straight out of liberation theology and a misrepresentation of the Bible. That was what their conclusion. And these were Black pastors, which I found very interesting. As I've gone through this book, yes, I'm very much aware that this is part of the teaching that a lot of people in Black United Methodist churches receive. I had a major dose of what it's like to, or what they are taught in the Methodist church, in Black churches in and around Atlanta, and what the curriculum is at, I think it's, what is it, Asbury Theological Seminary in Atlanta, where they have an entire curriculum you can major in Black liberation theology. And I've looked at some of those textbooks, and this is right out of it, which I find interesting because Azusa Street, I don't know if this particular university is really connected with it, but in 1906, there was something called the Azusa Street Revival. And that was the Second Great Awakening, or the beginning of the Second Great Awakening, and the introduction really of Pentecostalism into the United States. But you know, it's been an interesting read, but I disagree with a lot of their theses, and I understand it's their perspective. I would like another gentleman that who also is Black. He is from Africa. He does a lot of ministry work in the United States, to get his opinion on it. He is on record, both in his writings and in meetings I've attended, saying that what he has noticed about most white people in this country is, yes, there is racism, but he goes, a lot of white people, there is no racism in there. There's not a shred of it. But what we do not understand as white people is that we have had economic advantages that members of minority groups have not had, and therefore we have had a leg up, and we don't see that. Well, I know in this country we tried to address a lot of that in the 1970s with affirmative action laws, where if you were a person of color and you had equal or even less experience or training or whatever, but you were applying for the same job, if you met basic minimum criteria, you were to receive that job over a white person. And it was all done to help lift up, it was part of the Great Society program, and lift up Black Americans. I don't know, it would be interesting. It's also reminds me of what I have been told by leaders in Black churches in and around Atlanta. They have said that when a white person says they don't see color, they don't look at the color, they look at the character of the person and all this. What we are saying to a Black person who has been raised in identity politics, where their sole being comes from being Black, is that we don't see you, we do not hear you. And I found that very interesting. And those were discussions that were being held when Black Lives Matter came out and there were all the riotings beginning back in June. So that was an interesting perspective because I hadn't thought about that. But God, these were well-educated people, but they had been, again, brought up in Black churches. A lot of them have left Black churches. A lot of these Black ministers have left Black churches because they realize this is not the gospel, what is being taught. And so they have walked away, and many of them have paid a huge price for it. But I agree with them. I mean, congratulations, they wrote a book. They feel very strongly about it. But I can sit here and I can argue on each and every chapter. And I know I will be in disagreement with a lot of people on this call, but I can argue opposite points. So it's, what do you want to believe? And we all make decisions about what we are going to believe and how we choose to act with other people.
See, Mary Frances, I agree with you in many parts of this. I have felt very much that the book, actually, I find that it has almost no theology. It has a lot of history, and that is very interesting. But up until this chapter, they really haven't referenced the Bible almost at all. So it's not, I don't think it's coming from a theological place. So I don't think that that's the message that they're trying to convey. However, I do think that the message that they're trying to convey is very much what you were talking about. The idea that when we say things like, and I mean, I'm just as guilty. I'm constantly saying, when I went to school, Anthropology 101, there is no such thing as race. Race does not exist. Everyone is the exact same color, and your skin color has to do with DNA. It has nothing to do with anything. There is no real scientific basis for race. But in my saying that race doesn't exist, then I'm not acknowledging that some people have been hurt by people who have predicated their own history on that. So
Right.
I kind of feel like that's where the book's coming from. Although I agree that at times it hasn't done a great job of pointing that out.
Right.
I think viewing it as a history book is how to go, because I kind of have the feeling that there's a lack of theology too, and the lack of the biblical underpinnings.
Mm-hmm.
But as you know, as a literature professor and somebody who reads history stuff too, it hits on a lot of the same things that a lot of those discussions are having, and especially with the historical movement of the church and other things like that. So I think on that it's key, and I think the one thing that gets me with it is the sparseness of the chapters. Like I said, the footnotes are doing a lot of work. If you don't know some of the things they're talking about, you know, and a lot of the historical background. So I think that that's one of the issues. But I did like the theological, or at least the biblical reading that they did in the last chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Whether I agree or disagree with it, I like that discussion. That's what I wish there may have been a little bit more of. Specifically, I kind of wish that there may have been more of how the Bible has been used to promote whiteness and these issues. I didn't really get that either. We kind of got that with the missionaries, but we didn't get specific verses like with slavery and things of that nature. So, and that's kind of me, even though I agree with most of what they're saying. Because when I think another thing that they're getting at here, and of course I don't have the same experience of meeting with numerous Black pastors or whatever, but I think part of what they're getting at too is the way that, or one of the things they don't touch on, I don't think, or they may have done it really early on, is the ways that these ideas even get into people, say a Black pastor or a Black person, and believing these types of things, right? Which I think they mentioned that maybe with some of the churches. But those types of discussions too, I think, are important.
Mm-hmm.
The dog came back here.
Well, you know, I think it's interesting as I've read literature through the years and history, and to realize how people of color, whether you're talking about Native Americans or Hispanics or blacks or whatever, you talk about people who are considered savages because they're of a different skin color. And there have been records of people who were ministers and missionaries who basically thought that it was okay to ignore people of color or the Native Americans or whatever, because what do you expect? They're just savages and they're going to hell anyway. And that has been a part of the culture and the history of not just America, but European spread of Christianity. And that is, whether we like it or not, it's there. And we don't have to agree with it or disagree with it, but it's there.
Right.
And so,
And I think that just made me think too of where did the church actually come from, right? I mean, it came from not Europe. And of course, the missionaries went out and the apostles went out in Europe, but that's not where it originated. Yet we have this whole kind of feeling in history that it's there. I think I agree with that.
and I think too about the fact that I think anytime something gains power, one group gains power or ability to dictate to others, that at that point it can become something other than what was intended. For example, when Christians were being persecuted, the church grew and there was a strong binding. And then once the church became accepted, then it began to persecute others in the name of what they did. And, you know, like I've said before, with French Huguenots in the background, there's that reality that if you didn't agree with the powers that be, you turned into a tiki torch or whatever.
Right. And we don't really have to look at, we don't really even have to look that far back. We can look at the Puritans, our own Puritan ancestors coming here and ostracizing people of other Christian denominations, or we can look at the Puritans coming here trying to escape the Anglican Church, where many of them had been killed, to try and get out of that. So, I mean, I think, you can look at lots of times that when the church aligns with the government, you often have, some degree of persecution. The same could be said for the Middle East today, where we have theocracies that have a great degree of persecution now.
Mm-hmm.
I was gonna say the thing that stuck out to me with this chapter, and I think Joyce was summing it up. I actually have it marked twice, and it's something I've thought about a lot lately too. Talking about Peter at the end, but a leader with the enormous influence of Peter may shed light on, and this is what I had underlined, the human tendency to sustain self-protection and power. These constructions, basically. And that's always what I've been thinking about lately, is the ways that, I mean, even the church, and I mean, what was the name of the sermon from First Baptist? Do you remember, Tim?
I don't remember.
Yeah, like what will America be when socialism comes, or whatever.
Something
And
like
that was like the sermon title. I didn't even listen to what he preached, but and then he had the senator, and this is going off, but he had like the senator, Louisiana senator, and somebody else, like another politician on stage talking to him. Those types of things, I guess, get to me more because it's a way to wield power.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Especially the evangelical church, and the evangelical push.
Which is why we all have to go back and just constantly renew our minds and ask Jesus, more of you, less of me. And if we go back and we decide that we're going to live our lives according to the Bible, we don't have these issues.
That's why I like the opening passage they had. I had no clue what translation that was from either, but I found it finally.
Which
Where
one?
was it from, Matthew?
It was from it's a translation I never heard of. What translation was it? Not Brunel, but Breneau English translation.
Now.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
I may have been it. But he's actually talking with the Pharisees, and they're asking him why, of course, they don't clean themselves before they eat. Jesus and the disciples, and then he quotes Isaiah for one right before that. But then he says, "You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to keep your tradition."
Well, I think that is something that anytime I hear the word tradition, of course, my daughter got stuck on Fiddler on the Roof when she was 4 years old, 4 or 5 years, and she watched it. And Fiddler on the Roof is not a little bitty. She watched that movie over and over and over again. And I already loved it anyway. But the idea of tradition becoming so important that you couldn't see past the intent of God's law to what change was threatening.
Right.
You had to keep your traditions no matter what. And so that was, I think, what Jesus was addressing, that they had become, their traditions had become more important than God.
Well, which gets back to the missionary chapter, right? And the worship chapter.
We have to force our traditions on other people because our traditions are right because they're our traditions.
Right.
We can't hear other people's traditions and listen to them and try to see where we can go with them. Instead, we have to change them, or that was the way it was addressed in the past.
Right, but our traditions, they make us comfortable.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, and that's part of the whole the notion in this last chapter about table fellowship. You know, we're most likely to eat with people we're comfortable with, and we're most afraid to expand our table fellowship to people that are different from us, whatever the difference means.
Right.
On the fact that today is election day, what we should be doing is trying to find a way to expand our table for those folks that are on the other side of the political divide. Because
Instead, I've muted them all on Facebook.
What's that?
Instead, I've muted them all on Facebook because I just couldn't take it anymore.
Yeah, but I mean that's really the challenge for us, isn't it? I mean that's the struggle, that we're so ideologically separated at this point. It's hard to find a way to expand that table fellowship. And so in past generations, it was around other issues. It was around gender. It was around, sexual orientation. It was around skin color. It was around language, and right now it seems to be, ideological. And so maybe the real invitation of this book, in the end is for us to take this last chapter and figure out how to integrate that into our lives in a more holistic way. I think one of the things that, I chose this book not because I had any particular, insight. I read, 2/3 of it but there were books that had a lot more theology in them and were rooted, but they were 300 pages long. And so it's hard to have a book discussion, with a book that's 300 pages long, and for us to maintain some kind of consistency, and I think Matthew's right. I mean, the authors relied a lot on, footnotes. The other thing is, it should be said that all of these folks are lay people. None of them are theologians. They're committed Christians, but none of them are theologians. So they're really writing from their personal sort of experience of how they've experienced the church and how they've also experienced the world being, you know, and so in the one sense, it is an academic book because they're all academics, but it's really a lay theology book. And so the type of theology in there is more narrative than it is, you know, scholastic, if you will.
Mhm.
You know, so it's probably more like, you know, Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from the Birmingham jail, which is narrative theology. You know, I mean, obviously he was a theologian as well, but still, you know, Mary Frances, one of the things that struck me in your commentary is, I, I'm not, I mean, certainly these folks are coming out of, I don't know if it's a liberation theology position, but it's certainly a liberationist position. I mean, for the most part, their PhDs are in education and not in even sociology, for example. But you know, having read a fair amount of liberation theology over the years, I don't think it's very radical liberation theology what they're putting forward,
Mhm.
and I'm not certain that.
I will agree with that.
And
I mean, it's not Jeremiah Wright or whatever his name is. you know.
well, but you know, Jeremiah Wright is not necessarily a liberation theologian, but rather a UCC pastor in an urban setting in America who was addressing, you know, the ills of American society as a Black person. That certainly makes him a liberationist, but no, I mean, the point I'm making is this isn't, you know, Gustavo Gutierrez, this isn't Leonardo Boff, this isn't James Cone, you know, and all of those folks are sort of academic liberation theologians. So, you know, I think this is maybe more like evangelical progressive theology, if there's such a thing, because they're also all avowed evangelicals. I mean, all of them sit decidedly on the far side of the of the Christian side of the evangelical church. I mean, the churches that they participate in are some of the most conservative churches in America. So, I mean, inside that sort of ethos, what is seen as progressive is decidedly different than what's seen as progressive in the Presbyterian Church USA or the UCC or the Methodist Church or the American Baptist. So, you know, I think that contextually where they're coming from is probably slightly different than where most of us that are on this call are coming from, particularly from a church tradition. I mean, I would say that Matthew and Melissa probably come from the most conservative church tradition of any of us, at least that currently continue to participate in that.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank
I was
you.
about to say Joyce too.
Yeah, but she doesn't participate in that
No.
anymore.
I know you clarified that near the end.
But you
And also, I
read
have
the
to say,
article too, Tim, Matthew.
when
The what?
You have to read my faith columns too.
And when Joyce was part of the SBC, it was a decidedly different denomination than it is today, too.
It was definitely at the point where it was beginning to crack. But the church I grew up in was decidedly much more far right. And it became progressively more so. And then I was beginning to already have issues and because of other things. And it was strange when I went to seminary to hear the very things that I had been thinking were wrong with what I was hearing be questioned there too. And then, of course, moved beyond it. But that was part of the whole thing, was realizing that as a woman, I was not accepted
Mhm.
in the larger body.
Not as a pastor, that would be correct, yeah.
Well, not as a pastor, not as a chaplain, not as much of anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. The-
Not as a deacon, not as anything.
Right.
As a preschool minister, maybe.
Yeah, or it could work with youth as long as you didn't try to tell them what.
Music.
Right.
So I didn't ever find anything because oftentimes those colleges don't like to publish stuff like right out there on their page. Do we know whether Azusa Pacific admits LGBTQ students?
What I would say, I don't know, but what I would say about both Wheaton and Azusa Pacific, because I mean, they're both part of very conservative
Mhm.
college sort of movements, and they're founded in sort of the fundamentalist sort of bent of conservatism, if you will. They all have, you know, LGBTQI students on their campus. My suspicion is that in the old days, they sent them to reparative therapy or something. They're probably not doing that anymore, but they probably, you know.
I mean, at Truett and at Toccoa, you will be expelled for that.
Well, and that what I was going to say is you can't be out. So you, if it's known, you probably get expelled. But it's certainly in the old days, both of them probably sent their students to some kind of reparative therapy treatment or whatever.
So there's actually like policy to remove them or to expel
yeah.
them.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I wouldn't doubt that they probably, both Wheaton and Azusa Pacific have those policies. My suspicion is that faculty that like wrote this book probably know students that are gay and lesbian and probably haven't outed them and probably are trying to be somewhat supportive of them. That would be my real suspicion, is that students have found some safe spaces in those communities. Particularly because, I mean, there's not a significant minority of, I mean, there's a growing minority in the evangelical community that is open to LGBT persons. And so, you know, even some large churches are now making space for them.
Mhm.
You know. I don't know, other thoughts? I hope everybody enjoyed this. It was great for me. So the student side of it sort of fell apart. So I'm glad we were able to maintain this.
Well, I enjoyed it, Tim, and I hope we can find another book that we can do as well, because I think this has been good for us. And I
Well-
think it's good to hear other people's thoughts and to go beyond where we are to see somebody else's point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think next semester, I probably will try to do another book discussion or two. So if I find something that seems appealing for adults and not just college students, you know, we'll do it. I am teaching public theology next semester, so that will have its own interest. In a way, some of the things we've discussed here will segue into the public theology course. You know, and if you really want theology, you can come in and audit that, because well, you know, we're going to read 6 books of hard theology.
I'll just come make coffee and talk to you.
I've done enough of that.
Yeah, you don't want to do that, Joyce? Hey, but Joyce, they're fun. We got Thich Nhat Hanh we're going to read, and, you know, we got Malcolm X we're going to read.
Well, that might be more interesting than the theology I had to study.
Well, yeah, we're going to read also, you know, Max Stackhouse, which will be decidedly very different And, you know,
No clue who half of these names are.
well, you know who Malcolm X is.
Yeah, that's the only one I knew. I need to learn from you.
Thich Nhat Hanh is a Buddhist theologian. He's a Vietnamese monk, and he was the one that started the Plum Village in France. And he's been holding on, like literally for the last 2 years. He's gone back to Vietnam to his monastery where he's a novice. And in fact, when we were in Vietnam, we went to the monastery, and he was on his deathbed then, and that was in May of 2019. And I just saw a report the other day that they were calling in all the monks from the world because he was still alive, but he hadn't eaten food for like 2.5 weeks.
Wow.
Oh,
But
How old is he?
80 something, 90. He was born, he got excommunicated by the Vietnamese government during the Vietnam War because he spoke out against the government's activities, the war activities. And so he was sent into exile, and he lived in exile almost his entire adult life in France. But
So he spoke out against the North Vietnamese?
yeah. But he's a pacifist. I mean, he was against the war in general.
Well, but yeah, I want to learn more because I find it interesting they went to France because, of course, Vietnam and the French colony, I mean, all that. So
All right.
I'm telling Melissa she needs to go to Vietnam because it looks gorgeous.
It's a great place. If
I
we
said, "Looks gorgeous. He's been.
if we do another study travel, Melissa, you can join us in some capacity.
What is that? Sorry, I missed that.
I said, if we do another study travel to Vietnam, we'll find a way for you to join us as, you know,
We're not doing India.
Chaperone.
a book curator or something.
Curator.
She can go to India with us too if we ever do that.
Yeah, there you go. All right. Any final thoughts on this? I don't, Bonnie, are you still there with us? I see you're online, but I don't know if you're actually there.
he's muted.
Well, I know that.
Bonnie? Okay.
Can I say one thing? Stephanie, I love your shirt.
Ah.
I saw you were- Sadly, I got weed killer on mine, so it's all messed up. It was a blue.
But
Melissa has a Saints
Are
one.
you talking about an actual Queen t-shirt?
Do what?
Are you talking about an actual Queen t-shirt?
Oh, wait, what is it? I thought it was Golden Girls.
It is, okay, yeah, it is. I just thought maybe you saw it as a Queen t-shirt. I didn't know
No.
you had a Golden Girl shirt.
No, so Melissa has one for the Saints. So like there's a I guess there's Flirty Girl did a Saints one with all of them on it with Who Dat on it.
oh my gosh.
One of the reasons Malcolm X was executed by members of his own group was because he had begun to repudiate and renounce his earlier writings. So I just wonder if that will be communicated to your students.
Oh, sure. I taught this class a couple of years ago, so we spend a good. We actually do part of the class. There's a book that James Cone wrote. It's called Martin and Malcolm, and he puts the two together in dialogue, dealing with all the civil rights issues. So it's really fascinating.
It is a good book.
But we also spend a lot of time looking at their own theological positions, and we watch some of their sermons and other stuff. So that's a good. We watched John F. Kennedy's speech when he talks about, being a Catholic and how he can still be the president and he's not going to be controlled by the Pope. So part of the class is public theology. The notion is that how to be a person of faith in the public sector. So that's really the underlying principle of the course. And so we look at lay folks, we look at religious folks and how they live their life publicly in the world as people of faith and how that intersects in politics and so, and society and so forth. So that's a pretty
Interesting.
fascinating class.
And if Biden wins, he'd only be the second Catholic, right?
Yes.
Mhm.
All
Well,
right.
Tim, I would like to say, I have felt like this group has been our own cable fellowship, that it has allowed us to really speak to each other, reach out, share our own experiences, and without judgment, and really learn a lot about people who maybe aren't all exactly the same. So,
I agree 100%.
I've enjoyed it because this is not conversation that I could have among my church peers.
I think you could with Lindsay
Maybe,
or
you know, a
Billy.
couple, but you
I
know, for
even
the
think-
most part, no, it's not the conversations that I would get. And
I even think
so-
you could do it with our Sunday school teacher. I have,
Yeah.
kind of. He's a good guy. He's Santa Claus. He really is. He's a Santa
he's
with the real beard.
imaginary.
Oh, hey, Santa Claus is real, Jen.
Right here.
He's at
You already know Santa is
Hey, he's at,
wrong.
he's at United. He's at United Way. Billy Boyd.
Mhm.
but he has an actual real
Yeah.
beard,
Yeah.
so he does a lot of Santa stuff during those
Oh,
holidays.
that's really fun.
This year.
Thank you so much for putting this together. I know it's a lot of work on your part,
Oh,
but thank you.
it was fun. So, and
Thanks
it's,
a lot, Tim. Appreciate you.
it kept me out of trouble. So that's always,
Oh, well,
Oh, okay.
you know, one thing I'll say, if any of you have any ideas about what kind of book you'd like to look at for in the spring, I'm open, you know. So certainly it can go in some other direction. This just, you know, obviously, as I said at the beginning, this really was sparked from some students at Piedmont and
Mhm.
sort of responses from the summer and stuff. So, but I'm open to any kind of discussion, and, you know, so if you all have an idea, shoot me an email and we can look at doing it, and, you know. So, thank you all. It was a lot of fun for me. So, and thanks for sticking with it. It's great that for the most part, everybody started and finished, and we kept going, and so that's good. So, well, now I guess we can go and see what's happening in the rest of the world.
the election.
Oh.
Take care, everyone.
Good
Thank-
night.
Tim, are you gonna close us in prayer?
Yeah, why don't you, Joyce? I'll let you pray for
I
it.
thought you would pray.
I'll let you pray.
It's your turn.
I know, but I'm gonna let you do it.
Oh, thanks a lot. Okay, let's pray. Most gracious God, we thank you for the opportunity to study and to read, to discuss, to disagree, but to agree. We thank you for a time of learning, a time of fellowship. We ask that you would help us to continue to grow, to open our hearts, our minds to greater learning, to more important issues, and help us to truly listen to those around us who often feel neglected. We thank you, Lord, for everyone, and we ask that you would walk with us. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good night.
See
and
most of you
you.
back on Sunday.
Don't-
Yes, we
don't
want to
stay up
see you
too
on
late.
Sunday.
Don't stay up too late.
No problem.